Welcome back to Decisions That Count. This is a show where we unravel the mysteries of the human brain and explore how to master decision making in a world with overwhelming number of choices. I'm your host, Dr. Shawn Watson. I'm a neuroscientist, entrepreneur, and a dad of 2 young boys. And I've spent my time researching decision fatigue and how to optimize our day and our livelihood for the decisions that we make.
And I'm Michelle, the co-host, here to bring the real-world perspective to the science. As a mom, marketer, marathon runner, and a bit of a self-optimizer, I know firsthand how decision fatigue can impact every aspect of our lives.
So in this episode, we're going to try and equip you with the tools and strategies to overcome cognitive overload and achieve peak performance in your personal and professional life. So whether you're a gamer battling on a computer, in a virtual arena, an entrepreneur launching a new venture or company, or simply someone who's trying to get through every day without being completely exhausted by the end, this episode is for you. You see, I also struggle with decision fatigue myself. It's why I got so interested in this subject. Trying to juggle the demands of research, teaching, running a business, and being a dad, I felt just completely destroyed and overwhelmed by the end of the day. And so through my research, and I discovered actually that I wasn't suffering from mental fatigue or feeling tired. It's simply that I was making way too many decisions throughout the course of the day, and each of those decisions became harder and harder to make. So for this podcast, I want to share with you what decision fatigue is, things we can do to try to combat it, and different people will talk to us from their walks of life of what decision fatigue means to them.
And today we've got an incredible guest joining us, Harvard MBA, Forbes 30 Under 30, the host of Southeast Asia's #1 tech podcast, Brave. He's a COO of Lucence, a groundbreaking biotech AI startup fighting cancer with precision oncology.
With his infectious energy, if you've seen his podcast, you certainly know about that. Impressive credentials and achievements. Jeremy's going to be able to tell us a lot about decisions and decision making and hopefully decision fatigue. So Jeremy, it's a thrill to have you on our show, and we're looking forward to speaking with you today. And please do give us tips on how to run a podcast as well.
Well, I mean, what's interesting is that you both mentioned your parents, and I'm also a dad of 2 young daughters. So you can give me tips on parenting as well in exchange.
Nope, can't help you there.
We'll figure it out along the way. If we had asked ChatGPT.
We definitely won't be the first
That's
or the
an
last.
episode of itself. Yeah.
You know, we will talk about AI today because I definitely want to pick your brains a little bit about AI and decision making as well. But before we get into that side of it, could you please tell us a little bit about maybe your kind of origin story, how you got here, because that list that I reeled off earlier is so impressive. You know, how did you manage to achieve so much and continually do it?
Oh, there's a lot there. Well, you know, I feel like when you say origin story, it sounds like Batman, you know, orphan kid in the alleyway after Christmas, right? Losing both parents. No, that wasn't like that. No, I think I grew up as a kid as a big nerd, you know. So, you know, I was really into computers, robotics, reading science fiction and fantasy, hanging out with my friends. And I think it was just fascinating to really be on the cusp of so much, you know, technology change. I remember, you know, getting my first computer, and then eventually kind of like, you know, using a lot of the internet and forums. And I think what's interesting was that I've always, in that journey, always benefited from the internet. I always was searching on the internet for advice, for tips, how to study. And I think that's been a big part of my journey ever since I was a kid. So my journey, I think, has several chapters to it. You know, first of all, you know, again, I was a nerd. I was in the Singapore Army. Then I studied at UC Berkeley, studying economics and business. And then after that, I was a Bain management consultant in tech and consumer across Southeast Asia and China. Then I left to build my first company, which was Social Enterprise, doing social impact consulting in Singapore. Then I went to Harvard, my MBA, and then there I built a second company in education tech, grew that out from pre-seed, seed, Series A, sold the company, and then after that, returned back to Southeast Asia from New York to be a VC in Series A, around the region, at Monks Ventures. And then after that, saw the opportunity to be the COO of Lucence. So tremendous journey along the way, and I still found myself confused, tired, irritable, So decision fatigue is a big component of my life. And I think this is a fascinating podcast because, I too also look for advice on many of these dimensions as well.
There's so much in there. But maybe before we start to kind of unpick a little bit about that and how you've managed to achieve so much, Shawn, could you just tell us a little bit about decision fatigue, like what it is and what's happening in the brain?
Thank you for the intro. I think what's going to be really interesting in this podcast is each of those journeys you probably saw decision fatigue in different angles. So I'll pick that apart for sure. So for our listeners who don't know what decision fatigue is, how I usually like to start is saying kind of what it's not. So it's not mental fatigue. So mental fatigue is when you feel tired and you need to increase your wakefulness. So you grab a cup of coffee or an energy drink, and then it perks you back up. Decision fatigue is actually kind of mutually exclusive to that. So you can feel wide awake and have decision fatigue, or feel very tired and have decision fatigue. And the thing about decision fatigue is it really has one of two consequences. So the first consequence is what we call decision avoidance. So this is when actually your brain says, too many decisions, I'm stopping making decisions for now, or you're avoiding the decision entirely. So it can be as serious as a soldier freezing in combat, or as benign as that that email in your inbox that you see the subject and you choose not to open it or read it because you know that you're going to have to make a decision. So you procrastinate and leave it in your inbox for the next day. The second consequence of decision fatigue is a bit more sinister, maybe. It's what we call default decision making. And this is when we've suffered from the condition, and then your brain will actually start to make unconscious decisions on your behalf. And the thing about default decision making is that your brain will choose something or a path or a decision that is what it perceives to be the safest or something that it's most comfortable with. So this is an interesting one because we may not be as obviously aware to default decision making. So two consequences, very different from mental fatigue, and it affects every walk of life. What fascinates me about this condition is, 15, 20 years ago, there never would have been this podcast because decision fatigue wasn't an issue in society. Because back then we thought to make hundreds of decisions a day, and now the number is something like the average person is making 35,000 decisions a day. So our parents didn't necessarily experience this at all. It's something that just we have to go through, and we're all parents here. Our children are certainly going to have to go through. And I know we're going to talk a lot about today, but decision fatigue is everything from being that dad and how we talk and treat and interact with our children to the COO of a super exciting cancer tech company. There's a whole wealth of kind of discussion topics that we can cover.
Can I just ask, so you're saying it's like a relatively new condition. Is this because of technology, of content, of the rate in which we're trying to consume and the amount that we're trying to do, and maybe our brain hasn't evolved yet?
Yeah, good point. And actually, I should caveat something is we've known about decision fatigue is just more a psychological condition. We used to call it something like ego depletion. And more recently, it's moved from psychology, and now we're starting to understand the physiological underpinnings. And I'm a neurophysiologist, and that's kind of what excites me. So why is it appearing in society now? It's just the content chaos, the sheer number of decisions that we have to make. And this is everything to hundreds of decisions a day to myself. I wake up in the morning and I open up Reddit and I scroll and, 100 posts or 200 posts. Every post is a decision to consume or not to consume. And simply put, our brain wasn't designed to handle this many decisions. It just wasn't able to. And I know we're going to hopefully talk about AI today because I want to jump into that and about productivity in AI. But yeah, we're in an area now that the human brain wasn't evolved for.
Is something happening physiologically in the brain?
Yeah, I mean, direct users to our first episode for the details, but very quickly speaking, the physiology behind it is the leading theory is it's all in the synapse. So we have a neuron, and an electrical signal comes down. A neuron is a brain cell, and then the next brain cell, that electrical signal turns into a chemical signal. Those chemicals we know as neurotransmitters. There's hundreds and hundreds in the brain, and then that crosses the synapse, and the electrical signal continues. One of the leading theories for decision fatigue right now is actually there's a buildup of that neurotransmitter, specifically glutamate in the synapse. And when a decision comes down or signal comes through, it's fine. The glutamate's released and then it's extracted from the synapse, so a new signal can come through. But if that glutamate starts to build up from repeated decisions or in situations of stress or anxiety, those clearance mechanisms may become impaired. So we see more and more glutamate, meaning the signal may not get through. So the signal to noise ratio becomes disrupted and the fidelity of that circuit becomes impaired. Now what happens is your brain still has to make a decision potentially. So it's going to resort back to networks that are more established, kind of more reliable infrastructure in the brain. That would be your default decisions that your brain may be making. So still a lot of work in the space, but that's kind of probably a good starting point for the foundations of decision fatigue.
Do you feel like you maybe have suffered from decision fatigue?
Oh, every day. I mean, I think that, every person rises to their level. And what that means is that obviously as a kid, you're making decisions about what toys to play, who's your friend. And, I have a kid, I see that in my own kids today, is that they're making a lot of decisions for the first time, right? Whether to be brave, whether to run away from a bee, there's a lot of different decisions that you make. And then obviously at university, you're making a different set of decisions. When I was in the army, it was a different set of decisions. And then as you progress and you advance in your career, you get promoted, and then you get promoted to a new frontier where the decisions are new, novel, and increasingly more complex, because the decisions that you had previously found difficult have now become easy, but they're below your job tier or level, right? And so I think it's quite an interesting dynamic where I find that over time, as things go up, the problems I'm facing are more and more complex, more and more stakeholders, and more incentives that have to be considered. And so I think it's interesting to sort through all of them.
One thing, Jeremy, with decision fatigue is we know that it can be exacerbated by the emotional or perceived emotional connection to the decision. So you recognize decision fatigue, which is great, and certainly your career, you've seen a lot of different iterations of it. Would you say decision fatigue for you, is it more apparent or more visible in home life as a dad, or professional life, from venture to consulting to now with this COO position?
Definitely more in my professional life. What I find, and I remind myself about the home life, is that this is a solved problem. And what I mean by that is that for thousands and thousands of years, humans have figured it out and raised kids. I am the product of thousands of ancestors who figured it out, and they didn't have Google, they didn't have next day shipping, they didn't have a supermarket. I mean, I'm just saying, like, they didn't have safety or security or food. Like, that I always say, like, being a parent, just 100 years ago, it was in the midst of global chaos and war, right? I mean, those were very difficult decisions that, my great-grandparents, for example, had to deal as refugees or migrants about their family decisions. So that was tough. And for me, I think that the home life is fundamentally straightforward, which is provide them a loved environment and provide them the best environment in terms of Maslow hierarchy of needs, right? Shelter, food, kind of like guidance. And so I think in the macro scale of things, as long as those things are being done, then it's okay. And whether you're optimizing for organic blueberries or normal blueberries, I mean, it's a decision for sure, but it's not the same level or scale.
They're going to be okay.
I'm going to be okay. I tell myself, I was thinking myself, as a kid, I never ate blueberries because it was a very expensive fruit to have, right? And then now my kids are eating avocado. I'm just giving an example, right? It's already a better life for them. And so in the grand scheme of things, I think that it's more straightforward, but of course it's emotionally loaded. But I tell myself all the time that, they are going to grow up fine, right? And I just need to be thoughtful about those decisions. And then within this band of decisions, it's going to be okay. So I think the home life is more straightforward because I know that it's not just me, but also the kid themselves, the entire body, the entire mind is focused on learning and growing. It's not my full responsibility. Mm-hmm. I'm a guardian, I'm a steward, I'm a role model for the child, but a child has their own set of responsibilities, so I can't control every part of a genetic expression, how her biology is working out, what she's seeing, like that's on her as well. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's that normalization of the emotional component, which I think afflicts some of my friends who feel so overloaded to the point that they say something like, I don't want to be a parent because there are so many decisions that have to be made. And I'm like, whoa, what is the range and the quantum but it's really the emotionality around that. So I think there's a home life. I think on the work side, I've been working in technology, in startups and high growth. And so we're at the frontier of three things, right? We're at the frontier of technology, a new wave of technology. We're at the frontier of new customer behavior because they've never bought this technology before. And we're at the frontier of a new team because this team has never been assembled before. And so every decision that you make in startups, either as VC or startups, is nobody's ever made that decision before. Now, today we look back and it was like, oh, railroads, that's a good idea. But that was 100 years ago. But back then, nobody had made that decision before. It was a new technology. There was new teaming and capital that needed to be assembled. People had to be convinced to ride a train. So to us today is a solved problem. And so when we look at today, the problems of today will be solved in 10, 20, 30 years time in the future. And it'll become a no-brainer for that. But I think people really underestimate the complexity of that. So sometimes when we're having a very difficult conversation around the room, I often say something like this. I say, okay, we are having a heated argument and it's okay because nobody has solved this problem before, ever in history. Because this exact amount of technology, consumer behavior, and teaming has never been come together. And this is the first time in the world that anybody's really thinking through it in our way. There's no Wikipedia, there's no ChatGPT, there's no Google, there's no textbook for us to answer that. And so I think that often lowers, the emotionality because people find it's difficult or it's principles. And I just kind of simplify and say, again, it is difficult. It's supposed to be difficult. Therefore, it's okay to have a difficult conversation. Versus for home life, I tell myself, it's easy. It's meant to be straightforward. People have figured it out before. It's a solved problem. So I think that's how I try to think about those things.
Fascinating. Yeah, I think, well, first you should probably be a counselor for my wife and I for parenting.
I've got my own issues at home. So, she educates me, I educate her. Let's not add more complexity. I think it's a square of the problem, right?
Second thing, or 2 points for what you just mentioned there, which is super interesting to me. The first is a question.
Yeah.
Do you find the rate of decision making has changed professionally? So are you making more decisions during a smaller period of time now than you did before at the beginning of your career? And second, I find it really interesting how you describe decision making is, and it could be how you combat decision fatigue maybe, is you try to take out the emotional component. That's what you mentioned there. Because as I mentioned before, like when a decision is tied very strongly to emotionally loaded, as you call it, you can suffer from it quicker. But your mind kind of works in a way to try to logically put it at where the situation is objectively, to try to bring out some of that emotion. So do you think that's maybe a way to combat decision fatigue from your side, is try to eliminate that emotional component as much as you can?
The biggest learning I've had as I've grown my career is not necessarily to bypass emotion, but to acknowledge it and also nurture it. So I think when it comes to like a math question, then obviously, there's a bit of logic, is known and solvable. When it comes to, for example, setting the revenue target for next year, now obviously you have a sales team that thinking about what they can achieve, but also they themselves are thinking about their sales bonuses and compensation. Obviously, we're thinking about company capital, we're thinking about finance and accounting. So there's lots of different components, but still at the end of the day, it's still 3 to 5 people in a room figuring it out. We're all human. And so we're definitely gonna have emotions. We are in full awareness of our fears and our hopes and our dreams. So I find that it's less about bypassing emotion or removing it, but more about acknowledging and saying it, right? So, if it's a hard decision, we should say it's a hard decision so that we know that we can be having a debate, that we can have a longer time to make the decision. So acknowledging that reduces the stakes or acknowledges the stakes where everybody understands that dynamic. And another part of that role as I've become more senior is that to understand that so much of life is really relational, which is not necessarily, I think, my biggest, natural bias. It's just that at the end of the day, again, when you have 5 people in a room, you have a long history, right? And that history is a history of trust. And trust is a function of, are you reliable? Did you deliver your promises? Are you thinking about yourself? Are you thinking about the team? Those are the different questions that people are having when they have that negotiation with you. And that's really key because once you have that relational component, then the decisions will become easier. because then you become like, hey, this is a reversible decision. This is a decision we can revisit in 6 months' time, or this is an irreversible decision. And then so we need to delay this until we can figure it out. So I think bounding those parameters and acknowledging the relationship is really key for that. I definitely do find that the pace of decision making has also gone up. I find that, when you are an executive C-suite compared to, I think, when you're a subject matter expert, is that you are switching between different domains. So for example, just today, I had to switch between finance from an accounting perspective to kind of like a very arcane, let's say, US healthcare system understanding, right? Because it's, and I say arcane, not archaic, but arcane because, it's a very, mythos dynamic, right? There's a certain magic that happens with everything there, right?
Yeah.
And so you just got to go through that process and understand how it works. And then after that, you switch to like HR policy. And after that, you're having a social event, then you're getting to know somebody on a relational basis. So I think there's a lot of context switching and it takes a moment for you to decompress and take that 5 to 10 minutes to reset your mind to be like, okay, I'm present and not, absent from a conversation. Because what you don't want to be is you're having a finance conversation, a mindset, and then you're supposed to have a one-on-one on professional development, but you still have that mindset, you're not really present, you're thinking about at work. And then for that person who's a recipient, it feels terrible because, your executive is not paying attention to you, for example, right?
Yeah.
So I think the context switching is sharper and much more different. And I think that's one of the big differences, I think, between, the manager role set of responsibilities where everything is in a half an hour or 1 hour block and doing a lot of context switching versus, I would say, the creator side of me, which is when you want to do deep work, you want to focus for 2, 3, 4 hours to really see something true and focus on one thing very deeply. And I think that's an interesting weightage where I have to batch my days, right? So Mondays for me are my managerial days where I try to do as much of that context switching because a lot of people need instructions, clarifications, and guidance for the week ahead. And then later in the week, that's when I can do the deep work of actually processing all the various work streams and being thoughtful about what needs to be done.
There is so much wisdom in a lot of what you're saying, particularly around kind of decisions are hard at whatever level that you're at. Decisions become the old decisions that were hard become easier the more that you maybe take on or the more you progress. There will always be hard decisions to be made. And maybe if there's not hard decisions to be made, maybe you're a little bit stagnant and it's time to progress. But I don't think I'd ever really thought about it like that before. That, of course, decisions that were once hard are now easy. So age and growing up and experience can come into this as well.
Yeah, I find it interesting too, how you define emotion. So what you talked about there and like acknowledging it and accepting it. We've worked with elite, like top tier athletes and protocols for mindfulness. So one of the most popular ones, the second component of it is acceptance. So you look at emotion through a review, you acknowledge it, and then you kind of deal with it and move on. So that's what elite athletes do before performance, actually, is how you talked about how you handle emotions. So obviously there's a lot of crossover there. And you're absolutely right. It changes as we grow older, to our toddlers. That truck is the most important thing in the world to them, right? And they're emotionally connected to it. But as we get, go through our career and personal life, it changes.
Yeah, I think there was some really kind of valuable just insight there as well as a parent. Like, your children are making decisions and there needs to be, you need to allow that as well. And there needs to be some faith in that their instincts and, their genetics and everything else will help them make the right decision. And if they make a wrong decision, they're going to learn from it anyway. So, I think we talk about decision fatigue in the context of, adults and work and parenting and everything else. But yeah, there's kids and thinking about their decision making. And I'm sure kids must be suffering from decision fatigue, especially with technology.
Yeah, it's the first phone they get, right? They're going to be inundated with social media choices and everything else. At a younger age, hopefully not as much. It's still just toys and whatnot. But You hit it on the nail too, that like 100 years ago, they didn't have any of this stuff, right? So the kids are going to be just fine. Yeah.
Well, it depends on what all this decision making is going to do to them and their poor brains.
Fair. Yeah. So Jeremy, one thing with your career, and it's fascinating as Michelle mentioned too, kind of the wisdom you developed over time, with decisions and decision making and decision fatigue and working through your career, and what used to be hard is now easier. What role did mentors play in your life? Did you have any mentors who helped you, walk through these decisions? Because for them, maybe the decision you were, challenged with at that time was actually one that they already went through and it was easy. So was mentorship a big role in your journey?
Definitely mentors are, I think, a key part of it. I think mentors are important because I think they are primarily role models. You really can't know who you want to become unless you see somebody in action, whether that's through TV or online, some heroic figure, or whether somebody's in your life. But definitely it's like monkey see, monkey do. And I think that's a really big part of it. I think mentors are also really important because they also tell you what not to do. And I think lastly, they have a trusted relationship where whatever they say can be heard by me, right? And I think that's really, the mark of good mentors. And, I think a specific example would be, when was in, kind of like Bain as a management consultant, I think there's a very big push on providing good role models. And I think it's clear because every rung of the ladder, they are high performers. And so you really get to see how they all act, present, be on time. And they can speak with a certain amount of, professional love or brotherhood in that sense, where they kind of like say, hey, out of guidance and camaraderie, I think you need to improve on this. And I think with that magic moment of access and trust, then you can actually hear what they're saying and you can absorb it. And I think that's really key because that magic combination of the role model, the trust, and also being able to hear that corrective guidance is really key. The truth is there are also bad mentors in life, and, they can be modeling the wrong behavior. And so in the military, I always remember that I had a military instructor. Obviously, I had some good ones, but I was a military instructor, and he would basically say stuff like, we're going to do A, B, or C. And then I would say something like, oh, like, how long would it take for us to get there? And then he would say something like, 1 week. And I'll be like, what? 1 week? And then he'd be like, stupid questions get stupid answers. Because he was basically saying that 1 week is impossible. But as me, who's never been in the military before, I was like, wow, 1 week, that's a lot, And it's like, no, actually, turns out the answer is 1 day, but he thinks he's exaggerating. And it's a way for him to say something like, don't ask questions that are stupid. And that's horrible if you think about it. But I remember absorbing that information. And I remember that for several years after that, I would actually repeat that statement to other people because, somebody would say, give you an example, would be like, the equivalent of it would be like, hey, Jeremy, how do you raise kids? And I'll be like, I don't know, with a spoon, and everyone's like, what? What do you mean by a spoon? And I was like, no, stupid questions get stupid answers, right? But the point was like, I kind of emulated a bad mentor, which represented a certain way of thinking in the military. And I had to shed that thinking because it wasn't working for me, right? Because in the professional career, you have to ask questions because the only way you get promoted is you get better, and the only way you can get better is you understand what you don't understand, and the only way you can solve what you don't understand is by asking questions. And so having to unlearn that and become very explicit about saying, I am the type of person that wants to ask lots of questions and never be afraid to ask what are stupid questions is really key because that's allowed me to climb the ladder in that sense and be in technology where every day the facts on the ground change every day with new technology, new customers, new scenarios. So that's really key. But you can imagine that if I didn't shed what was effectively a bad mentor, then I would be in a very different position. If you think about it, he was not wrong. He was kind of saying like in the military, there are some tasks that they don't want you to ask questions, right? They want you to jump and then you jump. You don't even ask how high, you just jump, because they're asking you to do something that is very contrarian to your normal life, right? Which is I'm asking you to potentially sacrifice your life, to put yourself in danger, to do something that's very painful and arduous. That's not a natural human instinct that you wake up in the morning saying like, wow, I would love to sacrifice my life today, And so a lot of that command and control is a way to shape that kind of personality and thinking. So it's not wrong for him to have taught that, but it was the wrong mentorship for the eventual career I chose. And I think that's a really key piece. That's something has been acknowledged.
I'd like to know how you deal with two types of decisions or how you would approach two types of decisions. So you've got decisions that are a big decision, but can be reversed, or big decisions that cannot be reversed. How would you approach your decision making with or without a team for both of those types of decisions?
At the end of the day, irreversible decisions are obviously much heavier, and actually, I think a lot more rarer than most people think. So, for example, making a decision about setting your revenue targets for next year. Well, those things change all the time, right? Whether you undershoot them or overshoot them, those change all the time. So sometimes people enter the stakes like, wow, this is like a shootout because the stakes are high. There's only one time to set it, but you're like, actually, it changes, right? Versus, I think irreversible decisions you have are
selling your company.
Selling a company, well, it is irreversible, but of course, it's a very long process. Yeah. So you can build, if we get it out, it's like exploring selling and talking to sellers, that's all reversible because you can always cancel the transaction. But definitely at some point, it becomes irreversible, right? So I think carving out, that decision into the various layers of the decision is actually quite key about what's actually reversible versus irreversible. So I think that's a good part about it. I find that most of the irreversible decisions from my perspective actually tend to be more on the personal front, I would say, rather than the business front. I think if I really think about it, because I think business decisions, is a big team, you're working, everyone's a professional. I think most decisions are reversible in the sense that, you're planning ahead, you're planning 1 year ahead, 2 years ahead. I think there's a certain kind of cadence to it. I think personal decisions are a lot more irreversible in many ways. Or at least if they're reversible, they're very painful. So I would say who you choose to marry is a big irreversible decision. In the short term, obviously, you can always divorce. And some of my friends, unfortunately, have divorced along the way. But, from my perspective, I would say being out of an unhappy marriage is probably better for your long-term happiness than feeling you had to be in it. But, getting into it, you had to be quite thoughtful about that, right? So I think there's an interesting dynamic about irreversible versus reversible decisions.
Yeah. Are you quicker to make decisions if it's reversible versus irreversible? Ooh,
that's a good one. I would say that I think that reversible decisions are always easier on average because you feel lighter, right? Because you can make those components. I would say I think the irreversible decisions in my head tend to be tied to values, I would say. I think there are bad mistakes people can make, so I think people just have to be thoughtful about that.
Shawn and I are working on a startup at the moment, which we haven't announced on this podcast or anything. So we'll see if we can decide to keep this in or not. But, I think we're early, we've got some money at seed round. And I think there is a fear right now, particularly from my side, from the marketing, is I have got a limited budget and I've got to have massive impact with this budget. We want to drive a lot of awareness, a lot of sales. We believe in this more than anything. So there's definitely an emotional component to it. In the past, when working for kind of your big organizations, I'm quick to decisions. That's my nature. I'm fast to fail. I'm like, let's go. What I'm finding in this situation, though, is I'm holding back, and I'm definitely feeling a fear of maybe making decisions. I'm listening to my gut less and probably being more considered. How do I find this balance? How do we find this balance?
Startups are hard. I mean, we have to acknowledge that running a startup and succeeding is an Olympic level sport.
Yeah,
it's supposed to be hard because when it comes to working as part of a large corporate, it's someone else's budget. It's part of a mothership that has already figured out their product market fit. People already buy them. It's a trusted brand. That is literally a job where it's a pass or fail component because you pass, you're above average, you stay your job and you deliver your targets. And you fail because you're unethical, you're horrible at your campaign. There are ways to fail, but, I think that dimension is quite, easy to hit that pass component, right? Versus, I think building a startup is like, it's like basically saying like, hey, if you get an A+ on everything, you still may not be the one that succeeds. And so it's a much higher level performance required, and it's a much more difficult, and like we discussed earlier, nobody has done it before. So as a result, I think that it is only natural that when the stakes are higher and the conditions are riskier, and there is some level of finite resources that you can spend, it is only natural that it's harder, you take more time. My advice would be to slice it thinner. So what I mean by that is, instead of looking at a budget as a whole, I would say it's divide it to like the nearest $100 or $1,000 and say, this is $1,000 or $100 that's for experimentation, and finding that learning within that slice, because $1,000 is a much more reversible decision, or at least much more smaller stakes for you to experiment and learn. And so the mistake that you make is you lost $1,000. But the gain that you have is you have the learning about how to spend the next $10,000, the next $100,000.
Yeah.
So I think slicing it thinner, it would be the way that I would get the marginal learning that you need to feel confident for the next ladder decision, which is, okay, I spend $100, I know how it works. I'm going to spend the next $1,000. I know how it works. Then I can ladder up the next 10,000, and that's how I do it. But I think people come other way around, which is I have a finite money of $1 million. And then it becomes very, very difficult like that. So I think slicing it thinner from the bottom up can be an easier ladder.
I always kind of think a lot of the time of that quote, feel the fear and do it anyway. Because I think there's an element with decision making of listening to your gut. And what your gut knows is you trusting your gut, because your gut has got 10, 15, 20 years of experience behind you. And so I don't know, I think there's kind of an element. Do you think you can overthink your decision making?
I mean, the answer is yes. You can always overthink, right? And I think the definition of overthink is to some extent whether you're right or wrong, right? So if you eventually make the right decision and you spent 10 years making a decision, that may be doable, maybe in a very large corporation, but it may not be survivable as a startup, right? So I think the tricky part about startups is that your lifespan as a company is in the 2 years, right? And every sprint is effectively, I'll say, at a 1 day to 1 week level. So I think thinking the buffer for what is overthinking is much, much thinner. And so the standards are different. So I think that's the tricky part about startups, is that velocity decision making really has to go way up because of the fact that you have a finite time against finite competitors with a finite market window opportunity. So all of that makes that different dimension, which is at the end of the day, everybody wants to make the right decision, which is a different dimension from how much time you spend on. And in the perfect world, it's a 2x2. You make the right decision consistently, and you are very efficient in that decision. But the truth, again, is like we said, is startups is an Olympic level sport. so the truth is, you are probably going to make bad decisions, and those decisions will be tricky. That being said, I would say that one way that founders can overthink is that in startups, again, because it's at the frontier of knowledge, is actually there isn't enough information to make a decision in a classic way. And so I think one of the decisions I often counsel founders is, say, the decision is not to make a decision. Your decision is to figure out what kind of information you need to make this decision. And that's actually much easier to tell. So what I mean by that is, okay, I need to decide what is the price point. And then the truth is, everybody's arguing in a room because there's no information, because this product never existed before in this market. So then, the reset conversation would just be, let's decide what information you need to feel confident about the decision. And that might be like, user interviews, asking people, getting a few facts on the ground, etc. So I think that's actually a really nice heuristic way to sometimes kind of like defragment the decision into something that's much more achievable.
No, I think that's interesting. I think when I switched from science to business, one of the things I noticed because in science you get very used to failing, right? So you have a new theory and you just test it and it fails. Like you just constantly fail. So you're used to making a theory and failing with it. I find when I moved to business, failure wasn't nearly as acceptable in the industry. So people were kind of scared to test, and scientists are probably too far the other way. It's just like, throw money to learn and test. So I think the thinner slices, have a theory, test it, then build upon, and not being worried because no one's watching over you in a big business sense that a fail is okay as long as you learn from it, I suppose. So it's really insightful, the thin part though, to grow step by step with that learning.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's it. If we're struggling with a decision, okay, ask the question, like, what information do we need in order to be comfortable then making the decision?
And we're lucky nowadays with AI, like you can, for very small investments, you can get actually huge amounts of data from, compared to probably 10 years ago for startups when, on the ground was literally people probably walking around asking people questions. They didn't have Google surveys or whatever else, right? So I think there's a lot of tools to leverage to get to that data faster.
Let's talk about AI. How do you think AI is changing decision making?
It's an arms race. So decision making is obviously key. We all make decisions individually. And I think what's interesting in the arena of business is that, we're not making an individual decision. We're actually making decisions against competitors and peers who are also doing some level of thinking. Some will be faster and some will be slower. And I often very much think of the Boyd loop, which is kind of like the military's framework around decision making, right? So observe, orient, decide, and act. So it's that loop of decision making, of observing the facts, making sure you understand what's going on, making a decision, and then executing the decision, and then turning that loop. And the dynamic there was that if you're in a dogfight and if you're two fighter pilots, if you could finish that loop faster than the other person consistently, then you would win the air combat component. And I often think about that a lot in the business sense, is that when you're competing with other people, it's not just a decision, but all of that, right? Which is, can you get the facts? Do you understand the facts? Do you decide? And then can you act? And then can you turn that loop faster than your competitors? And that's when you can have better R&D, faster products, faster go-to-market, etc. Because that's how you compete. And I think AI has accelerated all of those components. And I think from an individual user perspective, because I think from us in this room, we are early adopters by nature because of technology, because of our socioeconomic status, because of our work experience. We're early adopters. And so we are benefiting from that. And so we feel an advantage. That being said, I think that other people are also using those tools. For example, if you're in Silicon Valley and tech world, all your other startup peers are also using AI, right? Which is very different. For example, like if you're in a very large company, and then you're the only person using AI, then you're like, wow,
Star employee.
Yeah, I'm the star employee. And it's like, don't mention that, I paid $20 per month for ChatGPT, But then, in the startup land, everybody's paying for it. And then, so it's an arms race. And so, I think, there's an interesting dynamic where I think about AI is, I think we're benefiting from that early adopters where we get that leg up in certain dimensions. But I think where, if you look at the direction of it is, in 10 years, 20 years, would there be more AI or less? More, right? Will AI have more decision-making around the decision instead of just input? Would they have more ability to get data? And would they be given more authority to act?
I was about to say, will it be able to execute?
Exactly. And I think the answer is all of them. We're going to give them more and more capability across all of that, right? Dimensions. We see that, for example, in drone warfare today, right? So previously, sure, there was some basic computer vision to help drones be able to locate the enemy, and there's a human kind of like using the joysticks to manage the drone. And then now there's electronic countermeasures, and now people are saying, okay, can we let the drone make a decision? Can we let them be able to execute, kind of like to neutralize the threat? There's all this kind of dynamic, right? And then what it means is today that, in the military battlefield, drones are autonomous, increasingly autonomous, and it's very difficult to be a human soldier competing against those drones. And I think there's a very real human dynamic to military conflict.
Yeah.
And as somebody who's trained in infantry, it's terrifying because now it's like, it's like you were fighting another soldier and now you're fighting against, I'm going back from a reservist training, and theoretically in my head is if you ever go to war, then
T1000.
I'll be fighting against T1000s, Terminators, right? They're faster, more agile, and they're more expendable than I am, right? So all those dimensions make it very difficult. And I think I say that because it's a very real physical manifestation of something that's already happening in the world today. And I think because it's invisible in the business world, we kind of like underestimate that because it's already happening. It's happening in the stock markets in terms of trading activity. Most of the volume is being done by algorithms that are either, pretty much autonomous or human assisted. We see that in more and more dimensions. So I just think that we have to be thoughtful about that is that I think it is an arms race about how fast we can decide and execute and repeat that cycle. So I think it's going to be an interesting time for all folks.
Do you think we should be outsourcing our decision making to AI?
Many of us already do, right? I mean, for people who are discovering this podcast through a short, the algorithm made a decision for them to say, based on your prior watch history, we think that this clip from this podcast is helpful for you, right? When we go to a supermarket, all of the humans have made a decision to say like, okay, over the past 50 years of operating history, we have decided that, Pringles do really well in this corner of the store. And when you walk around, kind of like from a, right, turn right, and then you do that, kind of loop around the store, you're going to buy Pringles on the way out. But there's already a lot of hidden algorithms and patterns that are already structuring our behavior. And to us, it's normalized. And we're only, I think, pushing back now because these are new behaviors that will become the new normal for our kids, right? And, when I look at my kid, my 2-year-old is asking Google to play Wheels on a Bus, right? So she's going like, hey, Google, play Wheels on a Bus. And she keeps, because she hears us saying it. And so she's there and she has a voice assistant from the age of 2, right? And I didn't get a voice assistant all the way till I was in my late 20s, right? And I was an early adopter when I got those voice assistants, right? So I think there's an interesting dynamic where they're going to grow up with these algorithms and this outsourced decision making, and it would be totally normal for them.
This is wild. And it gets me thinking about when we say you are the sum of your decisions, the ones that you make and the ones that are made for you. And you brilliantly, were just giving some great examples of the decisions that were made for us. And yes, the algorithms are making decisions on what content we're seeing. Originally when I heard that quote, I just thought, okay, my parents making decisions for me when I was a child, my teachers, my employers. But actually, it's the algorithms. I also think about politics as well. Okay, our governments are making decisions for us, but you've got your algorithms. You've got, marketers making making decisions on what type of communications you're going to be receiving from a brand, when you're going to be receiving them, the time of day. And like you said, the design of the supermarkets, those decisions have been made for us for a long time. It's not just with AI now.
I think you touched on too, which I think is one of the scarier aspects, is humans are just such social creatures, right? So much of what we derive is our connections to one another, and AI or these language models can replicate it so readily, right? And I'm sure the dead internet theory. Like, at what point are humans just reading AI, chatbots talking to one another? But we're so easily manipulated through social means because we are social creatures. But I guess the good part is AI is still controlled mostly by man. I mean, their artificial intelligence is maybe, from a neuroscience perspective, a misnomer. There's fancy Excel spreadsheets. We have general intelligence. And do you think we're a ways away from that still? Like, 'cause that's general intelligence is when the robots can think for themselves, right? Yeah. And they self-recognition and all those big questions. But I guess, when I watch or read about this, it's just a tool. It depends on how humanity uses it, I suppose. But from your work and your company, maybe you can give a brief intro to some of the good news about what's happening in the space, because that's in your company, correct? What you guys are looking at. So, give us some good news about what's happening.
For us at Lucence, we're really focused on a world where everybody is able to catch cancer early and not have that horrifying, painful experience that so many of our loved ones have experienced. So, today 1 in 3 people in their lifetime will get cancer. So between the 3 of us, one of us will probably get cancer in our lifetime, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's a big problem, as you can imagine, because nobody would want to be diagnosed with cancer, whether it's liver or pancreatic or lung or brain cancer. There's so many types of cancers out there. And it's a horrifying disease that, is a very painful experience. So, I think what's interesting for us is that, sorry, let me say that again. So what's interesting is that if we think about it in a different way, is that, okay, if this is such a painful disease, like what do we do to not have it, right? And I think a lot of attention is very much thinking about drugs and treatments. It's just that the other part that's really obvious is if we catch cancer early, then the outcomes are so much better, right? So if you catch it early, you have a 4 times higher, better level of treatment. And if you catch it at stage 3 or stage 4, when the cancer is already spread, then your odds are very, very poor, right? And so the awkward reality is that about 86% of cancers are not caught by screening. They are caught because you started feeling symptoms like weight loss or felt tired. And by that point of time, actually, generally, the cancers has grown larger and it's not as early stage because symptoms are now showing up. So for our company, what we do is that so the key dynamic, of course, is that our company is looking for the signals of that in your blood. What that means is that actually, tumor cells, just like every cell in your body, actually leak DNA into your blood. And so, if you kind of do take out a sample of your blood and you do a sequencing to look at all the DNA code, it's actually about 8 gigabytes of code that represents kind of like a statistical sample of all of the cells in your body. And so if you have cancer cells, then there will be cancer cells that will be circulating in your blood. And so what we're able to do is through a liquid cancer biopsy, basically sequence all the DNA code in your blood, and then basically use that to look for signals of cancer. And we do this for both early stage and late stage. So for late stage cancer products, for late stage cancer patients, this product is Medicare reimbursed. We're basically able to help them sequence their cancer DNA so that we're able to select better treatments for them because we know exactly how they're mutated so that there's specific drugs that target specific DNA mutations in that. Kind of like, imagine like a Death Star and then you're like, what's that, kind of like, port, the vulnerable weak spots of those things to go after, right? So I think that's one piece. Of course, the other part is that we also use that for early stage cancer patients. What I mean by that is healthy individuals or asymptomatic. And, we help screen up to 50 cancers at a very early stage so that we're able to catch it before, obvious symptoms arise. Because again, it's invisible to you, it's growing in you, it's leaking DNA. And then we're able to kind of like do that. And so it's much more convenient for you. Obviously, it's much faster. And as we scale volume, as we get better, as we use that data to train AI and so forth, we are able to basically be able to deliver better and better outcomes over time.
Amazing. And is this something that you would do this screening yearly, from a certain age?
Yeah. So, first of all, cancer does rise as you age, obviously. So what I mean by that is, between your, 0 to 40, I think the chances of cancer are relatively low, but they increase over time. Obviously, there are lots of people who have bad luck or bad lifestyle factors. And then, of course, as you kind of like age, then your natural aging mechanism causes errors, which create the opportunity for cancer to rise in your body. So I think as a result, government screenings would probably recommend additional screenings when you're 40 years old, 50 years old, 60 years old, because there's a higher risk of those cancers developing during that time. In terms of how frequent you want to do it, it actually is dependent on how much you value your own life, frankly. So obviously today, would you do a colonoscopy every year, every 5 years, every 3 years? Would you do your prostate or mammogram? I mean, these are all government guidelines. And what we notice, of course, is that some people check annually because they want to catch it early as much as possible. And some people don't show up, right? Because it's too inconvenient. And is often expensive actually as well in terms of time, in terms of cost. So I think there's an interesting dynamic there where, I think what we envision is a world where everybody has access to cancer screening in a convenient factor called a blood draw, which most of us are comfortable with. And we envision a world where everybody can do this annually, such that, today, diabetes is not a scary disease, right? My grandparents, one of them passed away from diabetes. And today, it's a much more avoidable, understood disease for people of our generation today. And so I think, my dream, of course, is that for my kids, when they grow up, for them, cancer is just an avoidable disease that you just check every year to make sure you don't have it. And when you start developing it, you nip it in the bud and they move on with life. And I think that's a wonderful world for my kids to grow up in.
Thank you so much for just sharing just so much, and your wisdom, honestly. Like, your experience and learnings are so valuable. Really, thank you for sharing them.
Thanks for coming on the show, Jeremy. I would love to have you back, actually, because there's a lot of stuff we didn't talk about. We didn't get any of the fantasy novels or science fiction books, which
that's definitely 5 hours.
Maybe that's a different podcast. Yeah, but no, really appreciate you coming on and sharing your thoughts and insights. And I think you give a really unique perspective, and I think a lot of people find it valuable what we've talked about today.
I think you just remember that you are the sum of your decisions, and your decisions are such a precious resource. So really think about your decisions, prioritize what really matters. Don't be afraid to kind of reach out, find some mentors, and make better decisions, or make every decision count, as the name of the podcast is. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to Decisions That Count, leave us a review, share it with your friends, and of course we'll link to all of Jeremy's amazing channels below. Thank you so much, and we'll see you soon.